Hello and welcome to Bob's Programming Academy. In this tutorial, we are going to build a responsive admin dashboard using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We will not be using any CSS frameworks such as Bootstrap to build this dashboard. Instead, we will teach you how to build a layout using CSS Grid and how to make it look good on devices of different sizes using CSS media queries. This is what the admin dashboard looks like. At the very top here, we have a header. Below the header, we have the statistics section, which presents a graphic summary of the data and trends in our fictional inventory management system. Below, we have two different charts created using ApexCharts, which is a free and open source JavaScript library that helps developers create beautiful, interactive, and fully responsive charts for their web applications. On the left, we have a bar chart. On the right, we have a mixed chart that combines two area charts. This website is fully responsive and it looks great on devices of all sizes. This is what the project looks like on an iPhone 12 Pro. This is an iPad mini. This is what the project looks like on a Nest Hub Max. So, without further ado, let's get started. To build this project, you need a code editor. My favorite is Visual Studio Code, which is free and easy to install and has important features such as support for IntelliSense code completion, debugging, and code refactoring. I will be using Visual Studio Code in this tutorial. From within Visual Studio Code, we can also install various extensions that can speed up our work and improve our productivity. In this tutorial, we will be using the Live Server extension to launch a local development server that allows for a live reload of our project. To install Live Server in Visual Studio Code, go to Extensions and in the search field type Live Server. Next, press the Install button. Now, let's create a directory where we will keep our code. In Visual Studio Code, go to Explorer and click Open Folder. Next, navigate to the location where you want to create a new folder and click the New Folder button. Next, type the name of the project folder and click Create. I will call the project folder Admin Dashboard. Once you've created the project directory, click Open. Next, we need to create project files. We will need 3 files, one for our HTML code, one for CSS, and one for JavaScript. In Visual Studio Code, press New File and add a file called index.html. Next, press New Folder and add a folder called CSS. Inside that folder, add a file called styles.css. Next, press New Folder and add a folder called JS. Inside that folder, add a file called scripts.js. Okay, we've just created all the files we will need for this project. First, we will focus on the index.html file. Okay, let's start with a simple HTML5 structure. I will add the doc type, the HTML tag, and in the head section, I will add a meta tag and a title of Admin Dashboard. Inside the body, I will add a heading that says Hello World. We open our document with a doc type declaration. It's a way of telling the web browser what version of HTML we are using on this particular web page. Doc type HTML means that this page is written using HTML5, which at the time of making this tutorial is the latest version of HTML. After the doc type declaration, we open the HTML tag. is the root tag for our document, which indicates the beginning of the HTML content of our page. In the HTML tag, we can also specify an HTML attribute that provides some additional information. Here, we use the lang attribute to specify the language for the document. In our case, it's English. Inside the HTML tag, we have a number of different elements that describe what we want on this page, starting with the head section of the page, which provides information about the page that will be useful for web browsers. In the head section, we first use a meta tag to specify the character encoding, which tells the web browser how to parse the information contained within our page. Unless we have a good reason to specify otherwise, the value of the char set will typically be UTF-8. Next, we have the title of our web page. The body of an HTML page is indicated by a body tag. The body of the page is its visible part, the part that users ultimately see and interact with. Inside the body tag, we have a heading that says Hello World. You can think of HTML headings as titles or subtitles that you want to display on a web page, like a headline that describes what the page is about. HTML headings are defined with the H1 to H6 tags. H1 defines the most important heading and H6 the least important. Okay, let's check what our page looks like now. We will use the live server extension that we've just installed to launch a local development server that will allow for a live reload of our page. To start the server, click Go Live here in the bottom right corner of the status bar in Visual Studio Code. This action will load our web page in your default web browser. The page now displays the text Hello World. If you are wondering, 127.0.0.1 is the IP address for localhost, which is your local computer. The 5500 after the colon is the listening port for our server, and after the slash we have index.html, which is our web page. In Visual Studio Code, in the bottom right corner of the status bar, instead of the text Go Live, we can now see port 5500. To stop the server, click on this text. You will see again the text Go Live, which indicates that the live server is not currently running. Now we can start working on the structure of our page. First, let's link the three files so that our HTML page can use the CSS code from the styles.css file and the JavaScript code from the scripts.js file. We can include a CSS file in an HTML page by adding a link tag in the head section of the page. This link tag must contain a rel attribute that specifies a relationship reference to the style sheet. The second attribute we need to add is the href, which indicates a hyperlink reference and should point to the URL of our CSS file. Next, we need to include the scripts.js file within our HTML page. To do that, we add a script tag in the body section of the page. We should add it just before the closing body tag, and all the other HTML tags we are about to add should be placed above the script tag. The script tag must contain an src attribute pointing to the URL of our JavaScript file. Let's also add another meta tag in the head section, just below the meta tag specifying the character encoding. This viewport meta tag tells the web browser how to render our page and makes our page more mobile friendly. It says, make the content render at 100% of the width of all supported mobile browsers. Now, let's start building the layout of our page. We will use CSS Grid, which allows us to create two-dimensional grid layouts with rows and columns. This means that we can control both columns and rows at the same time. I will remove this heading with the text Hello World as we won't need it. Now we can start defining the structure of our web page. First, let's add a div tag with a class of grid-container. The div tag is typically used as a container for other HTML elements. We want to style it with CSS, and that's why we are adding the class attribute. The class attribute is used to point to a class selector in the styles.css file, which defines all the styles for a particular HTML element with this specific class assigned to it. Multiple HTML elements can share the same class, meaning that we can use one class name to style multiple HTML elements in the same way. Here, our div tag will be styled in the way that is described in the grid-container class selector in the styles.css file. Next, inside the div tag, let's add a header tag with a class of header. The header tag is typically used as a container for the head section of our website. Let's add a main tag with a class of main-container. The main tag specifies the main content of a page. The content inside the main tag should be unique to the page. It should not include any content that is repeated across the pages, such as sidebars, navigation links, copyright information, or site logos. Now let's add some CSS. In the styles.css file, we will define the style of our admin dashboard, that is the layout, spacing, colors, fonts, and other elements that make our web page look exactly the way we want it to look. In CSS, each style rule is composed of two main parts: a selector that specifies which HTML element is the target of the rule, and a declaration block that specifies how properties of the selected target should be styled. A style rule begins with the selector followed by the declaration block within a pair of curly braces. Selectors are patterns used to select one or more HTML elements that we want to style. This one here is a type selector, also known as an element selector, that selects HTML elements with a given tag name and applies the same styles to each element with that tag name. The type selector begins with a tag name to match. Then we define the CSS properties within the curly braces. I want the body of the page to have a margin of 0 and a padding of 0. I set it that way because I don't want the web browser to apply its default margin and padding around the body. This means that the body of the page will fill the entire screen without any extra space around the page. Here we have the body tag, but we could also use the type selector to style HTML elements that occur multiple times within a page, like a p tag representing a paragraph, for example. In that case, the same styles would be applied to all paragraphs. What we can see here is a class selector that selects HTML elements containing a class attribute that has been assigned a value matching the selector. The class selector begins with a dot followed by a class name to match. Then we define the CSS properties within the curly braces. Multiple HTML elements can share the same class, meaning that we can use one class name to style multiple HTML elements in the same way. The first step to creating a grid layout is defining a grid container. A grid container is an element that defines a grid formatting context for its content. For this exact purpose, we've added this div with the class of grid-container. We need to set the display property to grid. All direct child elements within that div now automatically become the grid items. Next, we need to specify how many columns our grid should have. For this, we use the grid-template-columns property. We set this property to a list of width values. We can use here fixed length units such as pixels or percentages, for example. We can also use the FR unit or the fractional unit, which represents the flexible length. One FR unit is one part of the whole. This means that one FR unit is 100% of the available space. Two FR units are 50% of the available space each. Four FR units are 25% of the available space each. So one FR unit is 100% of the space divided by the total number of fractions. If we want our grid layout to have 4 equal columns, we could say grid-template-columns: 1FR, 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 semicolon. This is an equivalent of saying grid-template-columns: 25%, 25%, 25%, 25%, semicolon. It means that each column would take 25% of the available space on the page. Next, we will specify how many rows our grid should have. For this, we use the grid-template-rows property. We set this property to a list of height values. First, at the top, we will have a header. It will be 0.2 FR unit. The rest of the rows on the page will take 3 FR units. The last grid property that we will set is the grid-template-areas property. This property allows us to describe what the layout looks like using easy-to-understand notation. The three properties we've just discussed, grid template columns, grid template rows, and grid template areas, together define the explicit grid of our grid container. Let's also set the height of our grid container to 100 VH, which means that we are setting the height to 100% of the viewport height. Think of the viewport as the visible area of a web page on a display device. So 100 VH is 100% of the available height of that visible area. Now, let's define areas within our grid that match the values specified in the grid template areas property. In the header, we set the grid-area to header, and in the main container, we set the grid-area to main. I will also set the height of the header to 70 pixels. Finally, let's add some distinct background colors to the grid areas so that we can easily differentiate them and check what our layout looks like. Now we can test this out. Click Go Live in the bottom right corner of the status bar in Visual Studio Code to start the server. This action will load our web page in your default web browser, and this is the result. At the top, we have a blue header with a fixed height of 70 pixels. The rest of the page, in beige, is the main section of our dashboard. Let's keep the live server running. It will allow for a live reload of the page so that we can see the progress while we are building the dashboard without refreshing the page in the browser. Okay, now that we have the grid layout ready, we can start building our admin dashboard. First, let's select a font we will use in this application. Go to https://fonts.google.com and search for the font you like. Select the styles you want. Copy the link tag and paste it into the head section of the index.html file just below the title. I also want to use icons in this application. There are many free icon sets and toolkits to choose from. In this tutorial, we will use material icons. First, go to https://developers.google.com /fonts/docs/material_icons and scroll down to the section Setup Method 1 using via Google Fonts. Copy the link tag and paste it into the head section of the index.html file just below the font link. I want to use the outline material icons, not the filled ones, so I will slightly modify this link tag and add the plus sign and the word outline. The default link we've just copied allows us to use filled icons, not the outline ones, so I've modified the link to get the version I want. To find the icons to use on our page, go to https://fonts.google.com/icons. In the drop-down menu, select Material Icons and make sure that Outline version is checked. Here we can search for icons that we would like to use in our admin dashboard. Okay, let's add some CSS. Just a quick note here, all of the various different CSS properties are described in detail in CSS documentation, so if you want to learn more about this topic, I highly recommend checking the documentation. First, let's style the body of our page and add some default styles like background color, the font family that we've just linked in the head section of the index.html file, and the color of our font. Let's also add a class selector material-icons-outline which we'll use for our icons. I will set the vertical align property to middle and the line height to 1 pixel. I will also specify some default colors and fonts that will be used in our application. Let's also modify the styles of the header and main container. Let's replace the royal blue color. I will set the display property to flex, align items to center, and justify content to space between. I will also add some padding and box shadow so that we can have a nice little shadow under the header section. When 4 padding values are specified, as you can see here, the paddings are applied clockwise. First to the top, next to the right, then to the bottom, and finally to the left. So here we have 0 at the top, 30 pixels on the right, 0 at the bottom, and 30 pixels on the left. Next, let's modify the styles for the main container. I will remove the background color since I want the main container to have the background color that I set for the body tag. Let's also set the property overflow Y to auto and add some padding. When 2 padding values are specified, as you can see here, the first padding applies to the top and bottom, and the second to the left and right. Now let's check what the page looks like after the changes. The live server is still running, so let's head to the browser. Great! This is the exact effect I wanted. Now let's work on the header. Let's work on the logo. I will add the text Bob's Company. Let's add 2 div tags. First div with a class of header-left and the second with a class of header-right. Next, let's focus on the navigation menu. Let's add an unordered list. The list will hold menu items. Inside the unordered list, we need to add list items. Each list item starts with the li tag. Inside the list item, we will add an anchor tag indicating a hyperlink. The first menu item I want is dashboard. Search for the dashboard icon, copy the span tag, and paste it inside an anchor tag. I will quickly add the other menu items. Inside the div with the class header-right, we will add 3 icons, a notification bell icon, an email icon, and a user account icon. Okay, let's add some CSS. Just a quick note here, all of the various different CSS properties are described in detail in CSS documentation, so if you want to learn more about this topic, I highly recommend checking the documentation. Now let's check what the page looks like after the changes. The live server is still running, so let's head to the browser. Great, everything is working as expected. We have the logo and the navigation menu. Now let's work on the main section of the page. Let's add a div with a class of main-cards. This div will be a container for the statistics section, which will present a graphic summary of the data and trends in our fictional inventory management system. In this section, we add 4 cards. The first to display the number of products currently available for sale, the second to display the number of purchase orders, the third to display the number of sales orders, and the fourth to display the number of inventory alerts in the system. First, let's add a div with a class of card and then inside another div with a class of card-inner. Inside the div with the class of card-inner, add a p tag. Inside the p tag, type products. Just below the p tag, we will add an icon. Search for the inventory icon, copy the span tag, and paste it below the div with the class of card-inner. Add a span tag with a class of text-primary. Inside the span tag, type the number 249. This is our first card. We want 3 more cards. Now, let's add style rules for the main section of the page. First, let's define style rules for the class main-title. I will set the display property to flex and justify content to space between. Next, let's use the CSS child selector to define style rules for the p tag. I will set the font size property to 20 pixels. Next, let's define style rules for the class main-cards. For the cards, I want to create a grid layout. I will set the display property to grid and grid template columns to 1fr, 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 which means that we will have 4 columns and each will take 25% of the available space. Next, I will set the gap property to 20 pixels. This property defines the size of the gap between the grid columns. Finally, I will also set the margin property. When the 2 margin values are specified, the first margin applies to the top and bottom, the second to the left and right. So here we will have a margin of 20 pixels at the top and bottom and 0 on the left and right. Next, let's define style rules for the class card. I will set the display property to flex, flex direction to column, justify content to space around, padding to 25 pixels, background color and box sizing to border box. I will also add a border radius of 5 pixels and the same box shadow as under the header section. To define the next style rules, we will use a new type of CSS selector. The first child selector is used to select the specified selector only if it is the first child of its parent. Here, we have a div with the class of main-cards, and inside the div, we have 4 different cards. I want to style each card in a different way. The first child selector will allow us to select a div with a class of card that is the first child of the div with the class of main-cards. In other words, using the first child selector, we can select the first card out of 4. For this card, I will add on the left side a blue solid border with a width of 7 pixels. Next, let's define style rules for the second card. we will use a new type of CSS selector. The nth child selector is used to select the specified selector only if it is the nth child of its parent. Here we want to select a div with a class of card that is the second child of the div with the class of main-cards. In other words, we want to select the second card out of 4. For this card, I will add on the left side an orange solid border with a width of 7 pixels. Next, let's define style rules for the third card. We will again use the nth child selector. Here we want to select a div with a class of card that is the third child of the div with the class of main-cards. In other words, we want to select the third card out of 4. For this card, I will add on the left side a green solid border with a width of 7 pixels. Finally, let's define style rules for the fourth and last card. We will again use the nth child selector. Here we want to select a div with a class of card that is the fourth child of the div with the class of main-cards. In other words, we want to select the fourth card out of 4. For this card, I will add on the left side a red solid border with a width of 7 pixels. Next, let's use the child selector to define style rules for the span tag where the parent is a tag with the class card. Next, let's define style rules for the class card-inner. I will set the display property to flex, align items to center, and justify content to space between. Next, let's use the child selector to define style rules for the p tag, where the parent is a tag with the class card-inner. We can remove that part. Now let's check what the page looks like after the changes. The live server is still running, so let's head to the browser. Great, everything is working as expected. In the main section of the page, we have the page title and 4 cards with different colors and different icons. Now let's work on the charts that will be displayed in the main section of the page, below the cards. The charts will be created using ApexCharts, which is a free and open source JavaScript library that helps developers create beautiful, interactive, and fully responsive charts for their web applications. We will add 2 charts. On the left, we will add a bar chart. On the right, we will add a mixed chart that combines 2 area charts. First, we need to include the ApexCharts library within our HTML page. Go to https://cdnjs.com/libraries/ApexCharts and copy the script tag to the latest version. Paste the script tag at the bottom of the body section of the page, just above the scripts.js. We can remove that part. First, let's add a div with a class of charts and then inside another div with a class of charts-card. Inside the div with the class of charts-card, add a p tag with a class of chart-title. This will be the title of our first chart. Below the p tag, add a div with an ID of bar-chart. We want 2 charts side by side, so we can copy this code snippet and paste it below. In the second chart, add the title and change the ID to area-chart. Let's style these elements. First, let's define style rules for the class charts. I want to use here a grid layout. I will set the display property to grid and grid template columns to 1fr, 1fr, which means that we will have 2 columns and each will take 50% of the available space. I will also set the gap property to 20 pixels. This property defines the size of the gap between the grid columns. Next, let's define style rules for the class charts-card. I will set the background color property, margin bottom to 20 pixels, padding to 25 pixels, and box sizing to border box. I will also add the property to avoid column breaks when the screen size decreases. I will also add a border radius of 5 pixels and the same box shadow as under the header section. Finally, let's define style rules for the class chart-title. I will set the display property to flex, align items to center, justify content to center, font size to 22 pixels, and font weight to 600. Now we can start building the charts. On the left, we will add a bar chart. Let's go to the ApexCharts documentation and find an example of a bar chart. Go to https://apexcharts.com/docs/installation, and in the navigation menu on the left, select Chart Types and then Bar Charts. Here you can find information about the bar chart. OK, scroll down to an example and click on the link Horizontal Bar Chart. Copy the JavaScript code snippet and paste it to the scripts.js file. We need to modify this code a bit. Change options to bar chart options here at the top and at the bottom in the parentheses. Change chart to bar chart and change the ID selector indicated by the hash sign to bar-chart instead of chart. We need to do this because we will have two different charts, and each chart needs to have a unique ID. Those IDs are defined in the index.html file. The code snippets in the ApexCharts documentation use the chart ID, so we need to change that. Now let's check what the page looks like. The live server is still running, so let's head to the browser. We need to modify this code a bit. Just a quick note here, all the various different chart types and their many properties are described in ApexCharts documentation, so if you want to learn more about this topic, I highly recommend checking the documentation. Now let's check what the page looks like after the changes. The live server is still running, so let's head to the browser. Great, everything is working as expected. We have the first chart. Now let's work on the second chart that will be displayed on the right. I want to add there a mixed chart that combines two area charts. Go to https://apexcharts.com/javascript-chart-demos/mixed-chart/line-area and copy the JavaScript code snippet and paste it to the scripts.js file. We need to modify this code a bit. Change options to area chart options here at the top and at the bottom in the parentheses. Change chart to area chart and change the ID selector indicated by the hash sign to area-chart instead of chart. We need to do this because we will have two different charts and each chart needs to have a unique ID. Those IDs are defined in the index.html file. The code snippets in the ApexCharts documentation use the chart ID, so we need to change that. Now let's check what the page looks like. The live server is still running, so let's head to the browser. We need to modify this code a bit. Just a quick note here, all the various different chart types and their many properties are described in ApexCharts documentation, so if you want to learn more about this topic, I highly recommend checking the documentation. Now let's check what the page looks like after the changes. The live server is still running, so let's head to the browser. Great, everything is working as expected. We have the second chart. Now we can focus on the last part, making this dashboard responsive so that the layout will automatically adapt to the size of the viewing device and adjust when the user resizes the browser window. Right now, the dashboard is not responsive, and when we decrease the screen size, it looks like this. So how can we improve this? The key to responsive web design is using CSS media queries to determine the size and capabilities of the viewing device. Once the device size is recognized, the layout can be modified to look good using fluid proportion-based grids and flexible images to create a responsive layout. Fluid grid layout requires the web page sizes to be specified in relative units. We've already done that when we've specified the grid columns and rows using the FR unit. Now we will focus on the CSS media queries, which allow the web page to use style rules that are appropriate for the screen size of the viewing device or the width of the browser window. CSS media queries are essential for a responsive web design. You can think of them as basic conditional logic for CSS because we can apply different styles depending on whether certain media-based conditions are met. Media queries allow us to target specific CSS styles depending on the capabilities of a device, such as viewport width, screen aspect ratio, orientation, whether it's landscape or portrait, and so on. We use the term breakpoint to define a particular viewport width or height at which a responsive design should change significantly. In our admin dashboard, we will use CSS media queries to adjust the layout depending on the screen width. We will use here the maximum width media query. The add_sign media directive tells the browser we are starting a media query, and the screen part tells the browser that these rules should be applied to all screen types. We then have the AND keyword, which chains together another set of conditionals, which in this case is max width equals 768 pixels. This tells the browser that the style rules should only be applied if our browser's viewport width is equal to or less than 768 pixels. Our default layout works well for large screens. Now let's focus on what we want our dashboard to look like on small size screens. In that case, I don't want the summary cards and charts displayed side by side. Instead, I want them displayed one per row, so we will have the first card, below that we will have the second, then below that the third, and finally below the third card we will have the fourth card. The same with the charts. I don't want them side by side. Instead, I want the second chart displayed below the first one. First, let's change how the summary cards will be displayed. I will set the grid template columns to 1 FR unit, the gap to 10 pixels and the margin bottom to 0. As for the charts, I will set the grid template columns to 1 FR unit and the margin top to 30 pixels. Let's set the display property of the header left to none. We can now test this out. The live server is still running, so let's head to the browser. Great! The layout of our admin dashboard is responsive right now, and it automatically adapts when I resize the browser window. Everything is working as expected. We've now completed the admin dashboard, and we've learned a lot about HTML and CSS and a little bit about JavaScript. We hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel so you can be notified whenever we post something new. It really helps with the algorithm to get our videos out there to more and more people so that we can continue making them. We really appreciate it. Thanks for watching.